The conference room went silent the moment Daniel Frost's hand connected with Irene Hill's shoulder, shoving her sideways into the wall. "Relax, it's just a joke," he laughed, turning to the others for validation. But what happened in the next 3 seconds would change everything. Irene didn't cry. She didn't complain. She didn't run to HR. Instead, she did something that left a 6'2" man flat on the ground, gasping for air, begging for mercy. This is the story of how a quiet translator who everyone overlooked became the woman no one would ever underestimate again. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out, subscribe now for more. Irene Hill arrived at the Brussels office of Continental Exports at 7:30 every morning, a full hour before anyone else. She liked the quiet, the way sunlight filtered through the glass façade of the building, casting geometric patterns across the polished marble floors. At 26, she'd been with the company for 3 years, working as a translator and cultural liaison for their Eastern European accounts. The office building stood in the European Quarter, surrounded by other sleek corporate structures and the constant hum of international business. Irene's desk sat in the corner of the 3rd floor, tucked away near the archive room where old contracts gathered dust. It wasn't the worst location, she told herself. It was quiet. Private. Easy to ignore. And ignored she was. Irene stood just 5'3", with dark hair she kept pulled back in a practical bun and brown eyes that seemed too large for her angular face. She dressed conservatively, favoring neutral colors and simple cuts that wouldn't draw attention. Her colleagues at Continental Exports barely noticed her, which was exactly how she'd learned to survive in corporate environments that valued confidence and volume over competence and precision. She was fluent in 7 languages: English, French, Dutch, German, Polish, Romanian, and Russian. She could parse complex legal documents, navigate cultural nuances that tripped up seasoned executives, and spot discrepancies in contracts that saved the company thousands of euros. But when the quarterly meetings came around, when the big clients visited, when promotions were discussed, Irene was always somewhere else. Filing documents. Preparing materials. Making sure the coffee was ready. The morning Daniel Frost joined the company, Irene knew there would be trouble. He arrived with the kind of fanfare that made her instinctively retreat further into her corner. Daniel was 32, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of easy confidence that came from never being told no. He'd worked for 3 major firms in London before Continental Exports recruited him to head their expansion into the Baltic markets. Everyone said he was brilliant. Everyone said he was going places. Irene watched from her desk as he made his rounds on that first day, shaking hands, clapping shoulders, laughing too loudly at his own jokes. He had a way of filling a room, of making himself the center of gravity that pulled everyone else into his orbit. When he finally reached her corner, his smile faltered just slightly. "And you are?" he asked, as if her presence needed explanation. "Irene Hill. I handle translations and cultural consulting for the Eastern European accounts." Right. Daniel nodded, but his eyes had already moved past her, scanning for someone more important. "Well, keep up the good work." He was gone before she could respond. Over the following weeks, Irene noticed a pattern. Daniel had a particular management style that he probably considered motivational, but that felt more like targeted humiliation. He singled out people he perceived as weak, made jokes at their expense, tested boundaries to see who would push back. The junior accountant, Thomas, became calculator boy. The shy project manager, Elena, was mouse because of her soft voice. And Irene, when Daniel bothered to acknowledge her at all, was little translator or sometimes just corner girl. The nicknames might have been tolerable if they'd stayed at nicknames. But Daniel's behavior escalated in small increments, each incident just ambiguous enough to dismiss as playfulness, as team building, as just how things work in high-pressure environments. He'd lean over Irene's desk, boxing her in with his arms while asking questions about translations. He'd ruffle her hair like she was a child when passing her desk. Once, during a meeting, he'd picked up her notebook and read her personal notes aloud, laughing at her careful observations about client preferences. Irene endured it all with the same quiet composure she'd developed over years of being overlooked and underestimated. She documented everything in a private file on her personal laptop, noting dates, times, witnesses, and exact words. Not because she planned to report him, she'd seen how those reports ended, with the victim finding themselves reassigned or quietly let go, but because keeping records gave her a sense of control. What none of her colleagues knew, what Irene never mentioned during lunch conversations or coffee breaks, was how she spent her evenings. 3 years earlier, after a particularly bad experience at her previous job, Irene had walked past a martial arts studio in the Morales district. She'd watched through the window as students practiced, their movements precise and controlled, their focus absolute. Something about it called to her, the idea that she could be strong without being loud, powerful without taking up more space. She'd started with Krav Maga, the Israeli self-defense system developed for real-world situations. The instructor, a former military trainer named Ruth Weber, didn't care that Irene was small or quiet. Ruth cared about technique, about leverage, about using an opponent's size and momentum against them. "You'll never be the biggest person in the room," Ruth had told her during that first class. "So you need to be the smartest." Irene trained 4 evenings a week, sometimes 5. She learned how to break holds, how to strike vulnerable points, how to drop someone twice her size in seconds. She studied anatomy, understanding exactly where to apply pressure, where to hit to cause maximum incapacitation with minimum effort. But more than the physical techniques, Ruth taught her about presence, about the difference between being passive and being strategically quiet, about choosing your moments. "Most people mistake silence for weakness," Ruth explained during one session. "That's their mistake, not yours. Let them underestimate you. It's an advantage." Irene never told her colleagues about the training. She never mentioned the bruises hidden under her conservative blouses, the calluses on her hands that she covered with moisturizer, the way her muscles had become lean and powerful beneath clothes designed to conceal rather than reveal. At the office, she remained corner girl, little translator, the woman people looked through rather than at. And that was fine. Irene had learned patience. She'd learned to wait for the right moment. She just didn't know that moment was coming soon. The incident that would change everything began on a Tuesday morning in late September. The Brussels weather had turned crisp and clear, the kind of autumn day where the sun felt warm but the shadows held a chill. Irene arrived at her usual time, settling into her corner desk with a cup of tea and the morning's translation work. Continental Exports was preparing for a major pitch to a consortium of Polish manufacturing companies. The project represented millions in potential revenue, and Daniel Frost had positioned himself as the lead negotiator. For the past 3 weeks, he'd been holding daily strategy sessions, reviewing proposals, and rehearsing presentations. Irene had translated every document, had prepared cultural briefings that Daniel never read, had flagged potential issues with terminology and expectations that he'd dismissed with a wave of his hand. "I've worked with Eastern Europeans before," he'd said, not bothering to look up from his phone. "They respect strength. Confidence. They don't need us to tiptoe around cultural sensitivities." Irene had tried to explain that Polish business culture valued directness but also respected formality, that certain phrases in the proposal could be misinterpreted, that the representatives they'd be meeting came from traditional manufacturing backgrounds where relationships mattered as much as numbers. Daniel had cut her off mid-sentence. "Thanks for the input, corner girl, but I think I know what I'm doing." She'd returned to her desk, made her notes, and said nothing more. The Polish delegation was scheduled to arrive at 10 o'clock. By 9:30, the conference room on the 4th floor buzzed with preparation. Junior staff arranged materials, checked audiovisual equipment, and set out refreshments. The senior team, Daniel's hand-picked group of executives, gathered for a final briefing. Irene stood near the back of the conference room, her role unclear as always. She'd been told to be available for translation if needed, but Daniel had also hired an external interpreter, a man from a prestigious agency who charged 3 times what Irene made in a month. Just in case, Daniel had explained, though everyone understood what he meant. The external interpreter looked the part, tall, well-dressed, confident. He fit the image Daniel wanted to project. Irene had met the interpreter, Gregor, briefly. He was competent enough, though his Polish had a distinct Warsaw accent that might not sit well with the Silesian manufacturers they'd be meeting. She'd mentioned this to Daniel, who responded with his usual dismissiveness. At 9:45, Daniel called everyone to attention. He stood at the head of the conference table, his jacket off and his sleeves rolled up in a gesture that was probably meant to look casual but came across as practiced. "All right, team," he began, his voice carrying that forced enthusiasm that made Irene's jaw tighten. "This is what we've been working toward. This deal puts Continental Exports on the map in the Baltic region. It opens doors we've been knocking on for years." He paced as he spoke, his hands gesturing broadly. Irene noticed Elena, the project manager, taking careful notes. Thomas, the accountant, nodded along with every point. The room had that peculiar energy of people trying very hard to look engaged. "Now, I know some of you," Daniel's eyes flicked toward Irene, "have concerns about cultural differences, about communication styles, about making sure we don't offend anyone." A few people chuckled, though Irene noticed Elena shift uncomfortably in her seat. "But here's what I've learned," Daniel continued. "Business is business. These guys want a deal as much as we do. They're not going to walk away because we used the wrong fork or didn't bow deep enough. They're going to sign because we're offering them the best partnership available." He paused for effect, and Irene could see he expected applause or at least enthusiastic agreement. He got polite nods. "So let's go in there with confidence. Let's show them that Continental Exports doesn't just meet expectations, we exceed them. Let's close this deal." This time, there was scattered applause. Daniel grinned, feeding off the energy he'd manufactured. He turned toward the window, checking his reflection in the glass, adjusting his tie. Irene used the moment to review her notes one final time. She'd prepared translations of key phrases, had anticipated questions the Polish team might ask, had even researched the backgrounds of each representative to understand their priorities and concerns. None of this information had been requested, but she'd learned long ago that being prepared for opportunities that might never come was better than being caught unprepared when they did. At 9:58, Daniel's phone buzzed. He checked it, frowned, and then announced, "They're in the lobby. Showtime, people." The room shifted into motion, everyone taking their designated positions. Daniel would lead, flanked by the CFO and the head of operations. Gregor, the external interpreter, positioned himself near Daniel's right shoulder. The rest of the team spread out around the conference table, creating what Daniel had called an impression of depth. Irene moved toward her designated spot near the door, the place where she could observe but not be seen, where she could assist if needed but wouldn't distract from the main presentation. As she passed Daniel, who was doing a last-minute check of his notes, he suddenly reached out. It happened so quickly that Irene barely registered the movement before his hand connected with her shoulder. Not a tap, not a gentle redirect. A shove. Hard enough to send her stumbling sideways, her shoulder hitting the wall with a solid thud that echoed in the suddenly silent room. "Whoa, watch where you're going, corner girl," Daniel laughed, already turning away. "Can't have you tripping over your own feet when the clients arrive." The room held its breath. Irene steadied herself against the wall, her shoulder throbbing where it had made impact. She could feel every eye in the room on her, waiting to see how she'd react. This was the test, she realized. This was Daniel establishing dominance, showing everyone that he could do whatever he wanted, to whomever he wanted, and there would be no consequences. For 3 years, Irene had been patient. For 3 years, she'd documented and endured and waited for the right moment. This was not that moment. The Polish delegation was seconds away. Any confrontation now would jeopardize the deal, would make her the problem, would give Daniel exactly the excuse he needed to have her removed from the project, possibly from the company. So Irene did what she'd always done. She straightened her blazer, adjusted her notebook, and moved to her designated position. Her face remained calm, though her mind was calculating, analyzing, filing this incident away with all the others. Daniel had already forgotten about her, his attention shifting to the door as the sound of voices approached from the hallway. But something had shifted in that moment. Something that had been building for 3 years had finally reached a breaking point. Irene stood in her corner, her shoulders still aching, and made a decision. She would wait for the right moment. But when it came, Daniel Frost would learn exactly what happened when you mistook silence for weakness. The conference room door opened, and the Polish delegation entered. Irene watched Daniel's confident smile, his extended hand, his practiced charm. And she waited. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative. The meeting began with the careful formality that characterized Polish business culture. The delegation consisted of 5 representatives, 3 senior executives from the manufacturing consortium, a legal advisor, and their own interpreter. They entered the conference room with polite reservation, shaking hands, exchanging business cards with both hands in the traditional manner that showed respect. Irene observed from her position near the door, noting details that Daniel had dismissed as irrelevant. The lead representative, Pan Kowalski, wore a wedding ring and a small pin on his lapel indicating membership in a Catholic business association. The financial officer, Pani Nowak, carried a leather folder embossed with her company's logo, a detail suggesting pride in heritage and tradition. Daniel launched into his presentation with the aggressive confidence he'd promised. "Gentlemen, and lady," he added as an afterthought, nodding toward Pani Nowak, "we're here to offer you an opportunity that will transform your operations." Gregor, the external interpreter, translated the words mechanically. Irene caught the slight stiffening in Pan Kowalski's posture. The phrase Daniel had used, "transform your operations," carried implications in Polish that suggested the current operations were inadequate. A native speaker would have chosen enhance or expand. The presentation continued. Daniel spoke rapidly, his gestures broad and emphatic. Gregor struggled to keep pace, occasionally stumbling over technical terms. Irene noticed the Polish delegation exchanging glances, their expressions growing increasingly guarded. 20 minutes into the presentation, Daniel made his first major error. Discussing the proposed profit-sharing structure, he used a phrase that Gregor translated literally. In English, it sounded reasonable. In Polish, it came across as condescending, implying the Polish partners would be junior beneficiaries rather than equal stakeholders. Pan Kowalski's expression shifted from polite interest to barely concealed offense. He leaned toward his colleagues, whispering something that made Pani Nowak's jaw tighten. Irene felt her pulse quicken. The deal was collapsing in real time, and nobody on the Continental Exports team seemed to notice. Daniel continued, oblivious, clicking through his slides with the confidence of someone who'd never considered the possibility of failure. When Daniel paused for questions, Pan Kowalski spoke in measured Polish. Gregor translated, "Mr. Frost, can you clarify the terms regarding intellectual property rights?" But that wasn't quite what Pan Kowalski had asked. He'd used a specific legal term that indicated concerns about proprietary manufacturing processes, about whether Continental Exports would claim ownership of innovations developed by the Polish firms. Daniel, hearing Gregor's simplified translation, launched into a generic answer about standard intellectual property clauses. The Polish delegation's expressions darkened further. Irene made a decision. She stepped forward slightly, just enough to catch Pan Kowalski's attention, and spoke in flawless Polish. "Przepraszam, I believe there may be a misunderstanding regarding the specific question about proprietary manufacturing innovations." The room went silent. Daniel's head snapped toward her, his expression somewhere between shocked and furious. Pan Kowalski's eyebrows rose with interest. "You speak Polish?" he asked, also in Polish. "Yes, sir. I'm the primary translator for Continental Exports Eastern European accounts. I prepared the cultural briefing and translation materials for this meeting." Pani Nowak leaned forward, her eyes sharp with intelligence. "Then perhaps you can clarify what Mr. Frost meant regarding the partnership structure. The interpretation we received suggested a rather unequal arrangement." Irene felt Daniel's glare burning into her back, but she'd already crossed the line. Might as well make it count. I believe there's been a translation issue. The intent is for a fully equal partnership with shared decision-making authority and proportional profit distribution. The legal framework protects all proprietary processes developed by either party. She spent the next 15 minutes carefully clarifying points, correcting misunderstandings, and rebuilding the foundation that Daniel's presentation had undermined. The Polish delegation's body language gradually shifted from defensive to engaged. Daniel stood frozen at the head of the table, his carefully constructed presentation derailed by the quiet woman he'd shoved into a wall 30 minutes earlier. His face had progressed through several shades of red, settling on a dangerous crimson that suggested the storm building behind his eyes. When the Polish delegation finally excused themselves for a private consultation, promising to return with their decision within the hour, Daniel waited exactly 3 seconds after the conference room door closed. Then he exploded. What the hell was that? Daniel's voice cracked across the conference room like a whip. The remaining Continental Exports staff froze, their eyes darting between their furious director and Irene, who stood with the same quiet composure she'd maintained throughout the meeting. I was correcting translation errors that were jeopardizing the negotiation, Irene replied, her voice steady. Translation errors? Translation errors? Daniel's laugh held no humor. You just undermined me in front of the most important clients we've had all year. You made me look incompetent. The interpretation was creating misunderstandings that would have ended the negotiation, Irene said. Pan Kowalski was preparing to leave. You could see it in his body language. Don't you dare tell me what I could or couldn't see. Daniel moved closer, using his height to intimidate. You're a translator. A support role. You don't speak unless you're spoken to. You don't contradict me in front of clients. You certainly don't take over my presentation. Elena, the project manager, shifted uncomfortably. Daniel, she might have a point. They did seem more engaged after. Shut up, Elena. Daniel didn't even look at her. His focus remained fixed on Irene. This is exactly why we hired Gregor. Because I knew we needed someone professional, someone who understood their place. Someone who looked the part, you mean, Irene said quietly. Regardless of competence. The room went silent. No one spoke to Daniel Frost like that. No one questioned his decisions, challenged his judgment, or suggested his priorities might be superficial. Daniel's face darkened further. You need to learn your place, corner girl. You need to understand how things work in the real world. I understand perfectly how things work, Irene replied. People like you make decisions based on appearances and confidence rather than competence and preparation. You hire external interpreters who charge premium rates but miss crucial nuances. You ignore cultural briefings because you assume business is universal. And when your approach fails, you blame everyone except yourself. Thomas, the accountant, actually gasped. The other staff members looked like they were watching a car crash in slow motion, horrified but unable to look away. Daniel's hands clenched into fists. You're done here. Pack your desk. Security will escort you out. You don't have the authority to fire me, Irene said calmly. That requires HR approval and documentation. What you have is a bruised ego because someone 5'3" just saved your €1 million deal. Saved? You destroyed it. Those clients are probably in their consultation room right now, laughing about the chaos in our organization. They're discussing whether to sign immediately or negotiate for better terms, Irene countered. Because now they understand what we're actually offering. The deal isn't dead, Daniel. It's alive for the first time today. Daniel stepped closer, invading her personal space in a way that would have intimidated most people. You think you're clever? You think you can show me up and get away with it? I think I did my job, Irene replied, not backing away. Which is more than can be said for your external interpreter. The tension in the room had become almost physical. Everyone sensed that something was about to break, though nobody could predict exactly how. Daniel's phone buzzed. He ignored it. It buzzed again, insistent. With visible irritation, he pulled it from his pocket and glanced at the screen. His expression shifted from fury to confusion, then to something that might have been panic. "They want to resume," he said, his voice tight. "The Polish delegation. They're ready to continue." Relief swept through the room. The deal wasn't dead. But Daniel's eyes, when they returned to Irene, held a promise of retribution. "This isn't over," he said quietly, the words meant only for her. "Not even close." Irene held his gaze steadily. "I didn't think it was." The Polish delegation returned with news that Continental Exports had been selected as their preferred partner, pending final terms negotiation. Pan Kowalski specifically requested that Irene participate in all future discussions to ensure clear communication. Daniel accepted the victory with his practiced smile, but everyone in the room could see the muscles jumping in his jaw. He'd gotten what he wanted, the deal, but at a cost to his ego that he clearly had no intention of forgiving. The celebration that followed the Polish delegation's departure felt forced. Daniel accepted congratulations from the senior staff with tight smiles, his eyes repeatedly drifting toward Irene's corner where she'd returned to document the meeting outcomes. The CFO called it a masterful negotiation, though everyone knew the truth had been far more complicated. Irene worked through lunch, preparing formal translations of the preliminary agreements. She could feel the weight of attention, whispered conversations that stopped when she approached, sideways glances from colleagues who'd witnessed the conference room confrontation. By 3 o'clock, Daniel had recovered enough of his composure to send a company-wide email taking full credit for navigating complex cultural dynamics and securing Continental Exports' largest Eastern European partnership. Irene's name appeared nowhere in the message. She wasn't surprised. What did surprise her was the meeting request that appeared in her calendar at 3:15, performance discussion with Daniel Frost, scheduled for 5 o'clock in Conference Room B, the small room on the second floor that everyone called the box because of its windowless walls and single door. Irene stared at the calendar invitation, understanding exactly what it meant. Daniel wanted privacy for whatever confrontation he'd been planning since the Polish delegation left. 5 o'clock meant most staff would be gone. Conference Room B meant no witnesses. She could decline the meeting. She could go to HR preemptively. She could even leave early, claim illness, avoid the confrontation entirely. Instead, Irene accepted the invitation and continued working. At 4:30, she received a text from Ruth, her Krav Maga instructor. "Training tonight? You've missed the last 2 sessions." Irene smiled slightly and typed back, "I think I'm about to get all the practice I need." At 4:55, she gathered her notebook and walked toward Conference Room B. The second floor was already mostly empty, the support staff having left promptly at 4:30. A few scattered employees remained in distant cubicles, their attention focused on screens. The door to Conference Room B stood slightly ajar. Irene could see Daniel inside, standing with his back to the door, his phone pressed to his ear. She knocked once and entered. Daniel ended his call and turned. His expression had settled into something cold and controlled, the anger from earlier compressed into calculated malice. "Close the door," he said. Irene complied, noting the positions of furniture in the room. A conference table dominated the center, surrounded by 8 chairs. A water cooler stood in the corner, a whiteboard on one wall, a locked cabinet on another. "One exit." "Sit," Daniel commanded, gesturing to a chair on the far side of the table. "I'd prefer to stand." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I said sit." Irene remained standing, her notebook held loosely in her left hand, her right hand free. She positioned herself with her back to neither the door nor Daniel, maintaining what Ruth called situational awareness. "You've got a problem, corner girl," Daniel began, moving around the table toward her. "You don't understand hierarchy. You don't respect authority. You think because you speak a few languages, you can undermine people who've actually earned their positions. Is this the performance discussion mentioned in your meeting invitation?" Irene asked calmly. "Because if so, I should inform you that HR policy requires all disciplinary conversations to be documented and witnessed. This isn't disciplinary. This is educational. Daniel stopped 3 feet away, close enough to intimidate but not quite close enough to touch. I'm teaching you how things work in the real world. How people who don't know their place get put back in their place. I know exactly where my place is, Irene replied. I'm a senior translator and cultural liaison with 3 years of excellent performance reviews and a skill set that just saved your negotiation. You think that matters? Daniel laughed. You think anyone cares about your skills? You're a woman who barely comes up to my shoulder. You're invisible. You're replaceable. The only reason you still have a job is because I haven't bothered to fire you yet. You can't fire me without cause and documentation. I can make your life miserable enough that you quit, Daniel said. I can assign you to projects that go nowhere. I can make sure every idea you have gets shot down. I can ensure that your next 3 years here are even worse than your last 3. He moved closer, now within arm's reach. Or you can apologize. You can admit that you overstepped today, that you disrespected my authority, and that it won't happen again. Irene studied Daniel's face, reading the certainty there, the absolute conviction that she would fold. That she would apologize, accept the humiliation, and return to her corner where quiet women belonged. She thought about 3 years of dismissal, 3 years of watching less qualified people receive opportunities while she remained invisible. 3 years of being shoved aside, literally and figuratively. Irene retrieved her notebook from where it had fallen, her movements unhurried. You grabbed me first. Twice. Once this morning in front of witnesses when you shoved me into the wall, and again just now when you seized my shoulder and pulled me toward you. Both constitute assault under Belgian law. That was different. That was... What? A joke? Irene's voice remained calm but carried an edge now. Physical contact without consent isn't a joke, Daniel. It's assault. And when someone defends themselves against assault, that's not a crime. That's self-defense. Daniel's eyes darted toward the door, calculating. Irene recognized the look, the moment when an aggressor realized the power dynamic had shifted and started searching for exit strategies. I wouldn't, she said quietly. Right now, this is between us. You made a mistake, you learned a lesson, and we can move forward professionally. But if you try to turn this into something official, if you go to HR or the police, then I'll have to explain what led to my defensive actions. Nobody will believe you. Irene pulled her phone from her blazer pocket. I've documented every incident over the past 3 months. Dates, times, witnesses, exact quotes. The shove this morning was witnessed by 8 people. Your threatening behavior in this meeting was preceded by an email trail where you requested a private meeting in a windowless room at a time when most staff had left. She paused, letting that sink in. I've also been recording this conversation. Belgian law allows single-party consent for recordings when there's a reasonable belief that a crime might be committed. Your history of aggressive behavior toward female staff members provided that reasonable belief. Daniel's face went pale. You're bluffing. Irene tapped her phone screen and her own voice played back. I'm not apologizing. I did my job today. Then Daniel's voice, tinny but clear, you little, followed by the sounds of the physical altercation. She stopped the recording. I'm not bluffing. I'm prepared. There's a difference. Daniel struggled to his feet, using the wall for support. His confidence had evaporated, replaced by something that looked like fear. What do you want? I want to do my job without harassment. I want recognition for my contributions. I want you to understand that size and volume don't equal competence or authority. Irene's voice remained steady. And I want you to never put your hands on me, or anyone else in this office, ever again. Fine. Fine, whatever you want. Daniel moved toward the door, keeping maximum distance from Irene. Are we done here? Not quite. Irene stepped between him and the exit. Daniel flinched, actually flinched, pressing back against the wall. You need to understand that if you retaliate against me in any way, if you try to damage my career or create a hostile work environment, I will file a formal complaint. And I have enough documentation to ensure it's taken seriously. I said fine. Say it clearly. No retaliation, no harassment, no physical contact. Daniel's jaw clenched, the last remnants of his pride warring with the practicality of his situation. No retaliation. No harassment. No physical contact. Happy? Satisfied, Irene corrected. She stepped aside, allowing him access to the door. You should probably ice that elbow. And Daniel? What happened here today stays here. I have no interest in humiliating you. I just needed you to understand boundaries. Daniel yanked the door open and left without another word. Irene watched him go, then carefully locked the conference room door. Her hands were shaking now, adrenaline flooding her system in the aftermath of confrontation. She'd trained for years, had practiced scenarios like this hundreds of times, but training and reality were different things. She sat in one of the conference room chairs and allowed herself 60 seconds to process what had just happened. 60 seconds to acknowledge that she'd just fundamentally altered her relationship with Continental Exports, with Daniel Frost, with her own understanding of what she was capable of. Then she stood, straightened her blazer, and returned to her desk to finish the translation work that was actually due today. The next morning arrived with the kind of Brussels drizzle that turned the city gray and soft. Irene arrived at her usual time, 7:30, prepared for consequences she couldn't fully predict. She'd spent most of the night replaying the confrontation, analyzing her decisions, preparing for various scenarios. The office felt different as she entered. Quieter somehow, though that might have been her imagination. She made her way to her corner desk, passing Thomas, the accountant, who looked up from his computer with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Morning, Irene," he said, using her first name for the first time in months. "I have an HR meeting tomorrow morning. Then you'll handle it the same way you handled him. With preparation, clarity, and confidence." Ruth finished her espresso. "You've spent 3 years being invisible. Sometimes the only way to be seen is to make them look." The HR meeting arrived with the kind of institutional formality that made even innocent people nervous. Irene entered the third-floor conference room at exactly 9 o'clock, her documentation folder under her arm, to find not just the HR director but also the company's legal counsel and, surprisingly, the CFO who'd praised yesterday's negotiation. "Ms. Hill, please sit," said Director Voss, a woman in her early 60s whose reputation for fairness was matched only by her reputation for following procedure exactly. "Thank you for being prompt." Irene sat, placing her folder on the table but not opening it yet. She maintained eye contact with each person present, reading their body language. Voss appeared neutral, professional. The legal counsel, a man named Decker, looked mildly concerned. The CFO, surprisingly, looked almost sympathetic. "We've asked you here to discuss an incident that occurred Tuesday evening," Voss began. "Mr. Frost filed a complaint alleging that you physically attacked him during a scheduled meeting." There it was. Daniel had gone on the offensive, trying to control the narrative before Irene could establish her own version of events. It was predictable, almost disappointing in its transparency. "That's an incomplete description of what occurred," Irene replied calmly. "May I provide the full context?" Voss gestured for her to continue. Irene opened her folder and removed a printed timeline. "For the past 3 months, Mr. Frost has engaged in a pattern of harassment and physical intimidation targeting myself and other staff members. I've documented each incident with dates, times, and witnesses." She slid the timeline across the table. "This includes Mr. Frost shoving me into a wall Tuesday morning in front of 8 witnesses before the Polish delegation meeting." Decker, the legal counsel, leaned forward, his concern deepening. "You documented this but never filed a complaint?" "I was concerned about retaliation," Irene said. "Mr. Frost has significant influence in this company. I've witnessed other employees who challenged him being reassigned or pressured to resign. I documented everything while deciding the best course of action. Continue with Tuesday's incident, Voss prompted. Irene described the conference room meeting in precise detail, Daniel's threatening language, his physical contact, her defensive response. Then she pulled out her phone. I recorded the conversation because I believed, based on his prior behavior and the circumstances of the meeting, that Mr. Frost might engage in threatening or physically aggressive conduct. Belgian law permits single-party consent recording when there's reasonable belief a crime may occur. She played the recording. The room fell silent as Daniel's voice filled the space, his threats clear and unmistakable, followed by the sounds of physical contact and his subsequent begging. When the recording ended, the three officials exchanged significant glances. Voss's neutral expression had shifted to something harder. Ms. Hill, the CFO spoke for the first time. Why didn't you come to us with this documentation before the incident occurred? Because I've worked in corporate environments long enough to know how these complaints often end, Irene replied honestly. The person reporting harassment faces questions about their motives, their reliability, their contribution to the situation. Meanwhile, the accused, especially if they're valuable to the company, receives the benefit of doubt. I chose to protect myself through documentation rather than risk my career through premature reporting. Voss nodded slowly, as if this answer confirmed something she'd already suspected. Mr. Frost claims you attacked him without provocation, that you've been insubordinate and hostile since he joined the company. Mr. Frost is lying, Irene said simply. And I can prove it. I have 3 months of documented harassment. I have witnesses to multiple incidents. I have recordings of his threats and his physical assault. What does Mr. Frost have? A bruised ego and a sore elbow from being put on the ground after he grabbed me. Decker winced slightly. You understand this creates a significant legal exposure for the company? I understand that Mr. Frost created that exposure through his behavior, Irene countered. I simply defended myself when he escalated to physical violence. If the company chooses to punish me for that defense, then yes, the legal exposure increases significantly. The threat was subtle but clear. Irene had documentation that could support a harassment lawsuit, a hostile work environment claim, potentially criminal charges for assault. Continental Exports faced a choice: support the victim who'd defended herself, or protect the aggressor and face legal consequences. I have an HR meeting tomorrow morning. Then you'll handle it the same way you handled him. With preparation, clarity, and confidence. Ruth finished her espresso. You've spent 3 years being invisible. Sometimes the only way to be seen is to make them look. The HR meeting arrived with the kind of institutional formality that made even innocent people nervous. Irene entered the third-floor conference room at exactly 9 o'clock, her documentation folder under her arm, to find not just the HR director but also the company's legal counsel and, surprisingly, the CFO who'd praised yesterday's negotiation. Ms. Hill, please sit, said Director Voss, a woman in her early 60s whose reputation for fairness was matched only by her reputation for following procedure exactly. Thank you for being prompt. Irene sat, placing her folder on the table but not opening it yet. She maintained eye contact with each person present, reading their body language. Voss appeared neutral, professional. The legal counsel, a man named Decker, looked mildly concerned. The CFO, surprisingly, looked almost sympathetic. We've asked you here to discuss an incident that occurred Tuesday evening, Voss began. Mr. Frost filed a complaint alleging that you physically attacked him during a scheduled meeting. There it was. Daniel had gone on the offensive, trying to control the narrative before Irene could establish her own version of events. It was predictable, almost disappointing in its transparency. That's an incomplete description of what occurred, Irene replied calmly. May I provide the full context? Voss gestured for her to continue. Irene opened her folder and removed a printed timeline. For the past 3 months, Mr. Frost has engaged in a pattern of harassment and physical intimidation targeting myself and other staff members. I've documented each incident with dates, times, and witnesses. She slid the timeline across the table. This includes Mr. Frost shoving me into a wall Tuesday morning in front of 8 witnesses before the Polish delegation meeting. Decker, the legal counsel, leaned forward, his concern deepening. You documented this but never filed a complaint? I was concerned about retaliation, Irene said. Mr. Frost has significant influence in this company. I've witnessed other employees who challenged him being reassigned or pressured to resign. I documented everything while deciding the best course of action. Continue with Tuesday's incident, Voss prompted. Irene described the conference room meeting in precise detail, Daniel's threatening language, his physical contact, her defensive response. Then she pulled out her phone. I recorded the conversation because I believed, based on his prior behavior and the circumstances of the meeting, that Mr. Frost might engage in threatening or physically aggressive conduct. Belgian law permits single-party consent recording when there's reasonable belief a crime may occur. She played the recording. The room fell silent as Daniel's voice filled the space, his threats clear and unmistakable, followed by the sounds of physical contact and his subsequent begging. When the recording ended, the three officials exchanged significant glances. Voss's neutral expression had shifted to something harder. Ms. Hill, the CFO spoke for the first time. Why didn't you come to us with this documentation before the incident occurred? Because I've worked in corporate environments long enough to know how these complaints often end, Irene replied honestly. The person reporting harassment faces questions about their motives, their reliability, their contribution to the situation. Meanwhile, the accused, especially if they're valuable to the company, receives the benefit of doubt. I chose to protect myself through documentation rather than risk my career through premature reporting. Voss nodded slowly, as if this answer confirmed something she'd already suspected. Mr. Frost claims you attacked him without provocation, that you've been insubordinate and hostile since he joined the company. Mr. Frost is lying, Irene said simply. And I can prove it. I have 3 months of documented harassment. I have witnesses to multiple incidents. I have recordings of his threats and his physical assault. What does Mr. Frost have? A bruised ego and a sore elbow from being put on the ground after he grabbed me. Decker winced slightly. You understand this creates a significant legal exposure for the company? I understand that Mr. Frost created that exposure through his behavior, Irene countered. I simply defended myself when he escalated to physical violence. If the company chooses to punish me for that defense, then yes, the legal exposure increases significantly. The threat was subtle but clear. Irene had documentation that could support a harassment lawsuit, a hostile work environment claim, potentially criminal charges for assault. Continental Exports faced a choice: support the victim who'd defended herself, or protect the aggressor and face legal consequences. It means Mr. Frost's employment with Continental Exports has been terminated effective immediately, the CFO said. It means we owe you an apology for allowing this behavior to escalate unchecked. And it means we'd like to discuss your future role in this company. Irene blinked. My future role? Decker leaned forward. The Polish delegation made it clear they want you leading the cultural liaison and translation work for their partnership. Beyond that, your documentation and preparation revealed capabilities that have been significantly underutilized. We'd like to offer you a promotion to Senior Cultural Affairs Consultant, with a corresponding salary increase and expanded responsibilities. The words washed over Irene like warm water. Not just vindication, but recognition. Not just keeping her job, but advancing in it. There's one more thing, Voss added. We're implementing mandatory harassment training for all management staff and creating a formal reporting system with protections against retaliation. Your documentation made it clear our previous informal system was inadequate. 3 months later, Irene stood in a conference room remarkably similar to the one where everything had changed, but the context couldn't have been more different. Around the table sat representatives from 4 Eastern European manufacturing consortiums, all potential partners for Continental Exports' expanding operations. And at the head of the table, leading the presentation, stood Irene Hill. The key to successful cross-cultural partnerships, she was saying, clicking through her presentation, isn't just translation. It's understanding the underlying values, communication styles, and business philosophies that shape how different cultures approach negotiation and collaboration. The representatives listened with genuine interest. Irene had learned that when you spoke with authority earned through competence rather than demanded through volume, people paid attention in different ways. They leaned forward instead of back. They took notes instead of checking phones. They asked questions that indicated they valued your expertise. Her office was no longer a corner desk near the archives. She now occupied a proper office on the 4th floor with windows overlooking the European quarter. The nameplate on her door read Irene Hill, Senior Cultural Affairs Consultant. But more important than the title or the office was the shift in how people treated her. Thomas, the accountant, regularly sought her input on international financial presentations. Elena, the project manager, included her in strategic planning sessions from the beginning rather than as an afterthought. Even the senior executives who'd barely acknowledged her existence now scheduled meetings to discuss market entry strategies. The Polish partnership had exceeded all projections. Pan Kowalski sent her a bottle of Polish vodka and a handwritten note after the first successful shipment, thanking her for her invaluable guidance and cultural wisdom. The success had led to inquiries from Romanian, Czech, and Hungarian firms, all requesting Continental Exports as a partner specifically because of their reputation for cultural sensitivity. After the presentation concluded and the potential partners filed out with promises to review proposals, Elena appeared in the doorway. "That was brilliant," she said. "They were completely engaged. They understood that we respect their business culture," Irene replied, organizing her materials. "That makes all the difference. You know, I've been thinking about that day with the Polish delegation," Elena said, lowering her voice even though they were alone. "The day you corrected the translation errors and probably saved the whole deal. That took incredible courage." Irene smiled slightly. "I was terrified. But letting the deal collapse because I was afraid to speak up seemed worse than the risk of Daniel's anger." Speaking of Daniel, Elena's expression turned curious. "I heard he's working for a consulting firm in London now. Apparently his new colleagues find him intense but manageable. I wonder if getting knocked on his ass gave him some perspective." "I hope so," Irene said, and meant it. "I never wanted to hurt him. I just needed him to understand boundaries." "Well, you definitely taught him that lesson." Elena grinned. "The story's become legendary, you know. People call it the 3-second reversal. New employees hear about the quiet translator who put the aggressive director on the ground and changed the entire office culture." Irene felt uncomfortable with the mythology building around the incident. It wasn't about revenge or proving anything. It was about defending myself when I had no other option. "Maybe," Elena said. "But it was also about showing everyone, including yourself, that being underestimated is only a disadvantage if you believe it. You changed how this company thinks about talent, about leadership, about what strength actually looks like." That evening, Irene attended her regular training session at Ruth's studio. The class had grown since word spread about her real-world application of Krav Maga techniques. Several women from various Brussels companies now trained there, all seeking the confidence that came from knowing they could defend themselves. Ruth pulled her aside after class. "I've been thinking about offering specialized self-defense workshops for corporate professionals. Women who face workplace harassment but don't know how to respond. Would you be interested in co-teaching?" Irene considered the offer. 6 months ago, she would have declined, would have kept her training private, would have avoided any attention that might make her more visible. But she wasn't that person anymore. "I'd like that," she said. "But with one condition. We focus not just on physical techniques, but on documentation, legal rights, and when to engage versus when to report through proper channels. Self-defense isn't just about fighting. It's about making informed choices." "Agreed," Ruth said. "We start next month?" "Next month." As Irene walked home through the Brussels evening, past the lit windows of cafes and the distant sounds of traffic, she reflected on how much had changed. She was no longer invisible, no longer dismissed, no longer trapped in a corner while others received opportunities she'd earned. But more than external validation, something internal had shifted. She'd stopped apologizing for her competence, stopped making herself smaller to accommodate other people's insecurities, stopped accepting that quiet meant weak. The shove into the wall had been meant to humiliate her, to remind her of her place. Instead, it had sparked a transformation that changed not just her life, but the culture of an entire organization. Sometimes, Irene thought, the worst thing someone can do to you becomes the catalyst for becoming who you were always meant to be. 6 months after the incident that changed everything, Continental Exports held its annual company gathering at a hotel in the city center. These events had always made Irene uncomfortable, the forced socializing, the performance of corporate camaraderie. But this year felt different. She arrived to find colleagues who genuinely seemed pleased to see her. The Polish delegation had sent a representative specifically to meet with her and discuss expansion opportunities. Pan Kowalski had even sent a video message praising the partnership and specifically mentioning the exceptional Ms. Hill, whose cultural expertise and professional integrity exemplify the best of international business collaboration. The CFO included the Polish partnership's success in his keynote address, noting how proper cultural understanding had transformed what could have been a failed negotiation into their most profitable Eastern European venture. He didn't mention Daniel Frost or the circumstances around the deal, but everyone in the room knew the real story. During the cocktail reception, Irene found herself surrounded by colleagues asking questions about upcoming projects, seeking advice on cultural considerations, treating her like the expert she'd always been but had never been recognized as being. Thomas approached with a nervous smile. "Irene, I wanted to apologize. For months, I watched Daniel treat you badly and I never said anything. I told myself it wasn't my business, but that was cowardly. I'm sorry." "Thank you, Thomas. That means something. I've been thinking about it a lot," he continued. "About how many times I've seen talented people diminished because they didn't fit some arbitrary model of what leadership or competence should look like. You changed that here. You made it okay to be different." Elena joined them, holding a glass of wine. "Are we having the Irene changed everything conversation? Because I have thoughts." Irene laughed. "Please, no more mythology. I defended myself in a bad situation. That's all." "That's not all," Elena insisted. "You documented abuse when most people would have just endured it. You prepared for opportunities that seemed impossible. You stood up when standing up meant risking everything. That's not mythology. That's courage." The director of HR, Voss, approached their small group. "Ms. Hill, I wanted to inform you that the new harassment reporting system we implemented based on your recommendations has already been used successfully twice. 2 employees reported concerning behavior early, and we were able to address it before it escalated. You may have saved people from experiencing what you went through." Irene felt emotion tighten her throat. That was the point. Not revenge, but prevention. "You achieved both," Voss said quietly. "And the company is better for it." As the evening wound down, Irene stepped outside onto the hotel terrace, needing a moment of quiet. The Brussels night spread before her, lights twinkling across the city, the distant sound of music and conversation drifting up from the streets below. She thought about the woman she'd been 6 months ago, sitting in her corner desk, invisible and overlooked, documenting abuse while hoping things would somehow improve on their own. That woman had been competent and skilled, but she'd been waiting for someone else to recognize her worth, to grant her permission to be more than she'd been allowed to be. The woman she was now understood that permission wasn't something you waited for. It was something you claimed through preparation, courage, and the willingness to defend your own value when no one else would. Her phone buzzed with a text from Ruth. "Student asked if you're teaching this week's self-defense workshop. They specifically requested you. You're inspiring people." Irene smiled and typed back, "I'll be there." She stayed on the terrace a while longer, enjoying the cool evening air, the sense of peace that came from knowing she'd not only survived a difficult situation but had transformed it into something meaningful. The shove into the wall had been meant to diminish her. Instead, it had revealed exactly what she was capable of when pushed too far. Daniel Frost had intended to teach her a lesson about her place. Instead, he'd learned that underestimating someone based on their size or their silence was a mistake that could leave you flat on the ground, begging for mercy you'd never shown others. Irene Hill had been invisible for 3 years. But that invisibility had been armor, protection while she prepared, while she trained, while she documented and waited for the right moment. When that moment came, when aggression met preparation, when size met skill, when arrogance met consequence, everything changed in 3 seconds. And in those 3 seconds, the woman everyone overlooked became impossible to ignore. The terrace door opened, and Elena called out, "Irene, they're about to do the awards presentation. You should come inside." Irene took one last look at the Brussels skyline, then turned toward the warmth and light of the celebration. She'd earned her place at that table. Not by being louder or bigger or more aggressive, but by being exactly who she was, prepared, competent, and unwilling to accept that quiet meant powerless. She walked back inside, her head high, her shoulders straight, ready for whatever came next. Because the woman who could put Daniel Frost on the ground in 3 seconds could handle anything. And she would. One challenge at a time, with the same quiet competence that had always been her strength, now finally recognized as the power it had always been. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.